everybody. Welcome to Daf Yomi Week in Review. Lovely to see all of you this week in late September, deep in Baba Batra. Let's let everybody get in the door. I think we're just about in. I'm Rachel Scheinerman. I edit My Jewish Learning and A Daily Dose of Talmud. And this is where, of course, we do a 30-minute rapid review of what we learned in Daf Yomi over the week. More of a highlights than a summary kind of approach. Though sometimes there's some really, really excellent rapid summation that happens in these classes too. As you know, we have a rotating cast of wonderful teachers who do this for us. And this morning, morning for me anyway, we're joined by Rabbi Ari Sachs. Go ahead, Rabbi Sachs.
Hello, and thank you, everyone. I'm so excited to be joining you again for this year. And I am also very much aware of the calendar year. So for those who are observing, want to wish everyone a Shana Tova Umtuka, a happy and a healthy new year. And along those lines, there was a little teaching that appeared in this week's Daf Yomi set that I thought was appropriate for the high holidays and especially for Rosh Hashanah, for Yom Hadin, because we're talking about how to buy and sell. And part of the Mishnah and really there's a good piece of the Gemara was talking about measurements and what is perfect measurements and just measurements. And on Rosh Hashanah, we're told that it's a Yom Hadin, it is a day of judgment in which God is judging us by measuring our good deeds and our bad deeds on a scale. So in thinking about that, in terms of what it means to measure justly, I want to offer this teaching that comes from Baba Batra 89a. And from where is it derived that if a seller said, in a place where it is accustomed to let the scales tilt a handbreadth, I am hereby balancing with precision and I'm willing to reduce the price for the buyer, meaning that in this place, we're supposed to actually give more and then the buyer will end up paying more for the goods, but that, oh, I'd rather do it so it's even. Or in a place where it is accustomed to balance with precision, I'm hereby letting the scales tilt a handbreadth and I'm willing to increase the price for the buyer. So the other way around, if it's in a place where everything should be even, that you want to give a little bit more, and should that be okay? That in fact, the court does not listen to him. Why? Because the verse states a perfect and just weight. In Hebrew, Even Shlema Vatzedek, which teaches that the just way of acting is to weigh in accordance with the practice in that locale. And in thinking a little bit about the Yom Hadin of the Day of Judgment and of God measuring us, my prayer is that God is judging us in our locale, as we hear in the liturgy, that more tilting the scale more towards our merits, tilting it against less of our demerits, and that's what we need in order to survive. And so I pray that God will be able to judge us justly by weighing more of our merits, because that's the right way to act for us to be able to survive for another year. So that's my one little teaching for Rosh Hashanah. But the main topic I actually want to talk about for today is, and this is something I kind of bring up whenever I'm here, trying to understand how the Mishnah and the Gemara, how they function, how we can be able to find sort of the codes for the ways that you can remember each item, the different mnemonics, how it was structured. I want to talk today about the question, what is the Mishnah? What is the Mishnah? Now, some of you may have very clear ideas about what the Mishnah is, and I would encourage you to share in the chat what you believe the Mishnah to be. And we could go in a lot of different directions of it, but this is not a theoretical class. We're not just talking about the Mishnah. We're going to study some Mishnah, especially with the Gemara. But what I do want to raise two different ideas of what the Mishnah could be, or at least that what some scholars view the Mishnah as. One views it as the key legal text for how new Jewish life should be forming post the destruction of the Second Temple. Thus, the Mishnah teaches us how to live, how to build a society by setting up the key rules and laws for us to be able to follow. That's one idea. It's a legal system. The second idea is it's actually an educational system. It is a way for us to learn how to be able to judge cases fairly. and that it's less about the actual items that appear in the Mishnah and then discussed in the Gemara, and more about the way in which these discussions are formed and are engaged in, so that we can be able to imagine all the different possible cases that might appear. So that's those two different ideas. One is a legal text, and the other is an educational text that's done for rabbis, for leaders within the context of the community. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because there's two Mishnayot that really are, if we're looking at all of the Gemara for the Daf Yomi for this week, it's made up of four Mishnayot, but one of them is actually kind of combined with the other. So two of the first Mishnayot, of which there's not as much discussion in the Gemara, but both of them have a statement by Rabbi Yehuda. Now, you may have seen Rabbi Yehuda appear in many different times, but I want to give a little context to who Rabbi Yehuda is and why this question of what is a Mishnah, I want to think about from the context of Rabbi Yehuda and his placement, both in the context of the Mishnah and then how he's discussed in the Gemara. Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli, who is, anytime you see Rabbi Yehuda without a, what's it called? I think it's a patronym, or who they're from, like who their parent, who their father is. If it's just Rabbi Yehuda, it's Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli, who was a fourth generation Tana, meaning of that early generation of scholars. If you've ever read the book As a Driven Leaf, which I would recommend to everyone here, given your interest in Talmud and that period of time of learning in Jewish history, there is a scene in there in which the Jews are being persecuted by the Romans, and there is a smicha done of four different rabbis at the very last potential moment, and if these four rabbis were not given smicha, they may have lost all of Jewish learning and any future leadership that would ever happen. That story, which is dramatized in the book by Milton Steinberg, actually appears though in Masechet Sanhedrin, which, if you want to find it, it's page, oh, I had it before. Oh, it's Sanhedrin 14a. 14a, if you want to find it. Rabbi Yehuda, who we're talking about, he is one of those rabbis who was given smicha at that moment. So he's one of the rabbis who was able to continue the tradition of Judaism into the next generation. So just to kind of give you a sense as to who he is. But the reason I want to bring him up is because in these two Mishnayot, and by the way, he's mentioned over like 607 times in the Mishnah overall, he appears at the end of the Mishnah, or somewhat at the end of the Mishnah. And the fact that he appears somewhat at the end of the Mishnah is important for thinking about what is the purpose of the Mishnah. Okay, so I just want you to keep that in mind as we go through. So I'm going to share my screen. Those are able to see it. And we're going to start with a teaching from, or I should say, an understanding of what is the Mishnah from a contemporary scholar. Her name is Elizabeth Shanks Alexander, who talked about what's called the casuistic elements in Mishnaic law. Now, she's not talking about it from the perspective of our Mishnah, or our Mishnayot, but just in general, and bringing examples from Mishnah Shavuot. Now, it's important to know the term here, casuistic element. If you're a lawyer, if you're involved in law, you may have heard that term. Casuistic law means case law. Okay? Case law is if-then statements. If an ox gores your pregnant wife, then what damages are owed to you? That's kind of how it's formed. It's opposed to what's called apodictic law, which is statements. Thinking about the Ten Commandments, that's apodictic law. The vast majority, in fact, really all of Mishnah is casuistic law. It's case law. It's specific cases that are then brought to be able to teach you the larger point that can flow from that case law. So in terms of think about the question, is it a legal text or is it an educational text? The fact that it's case law allows for both possibilities, because case law is good for being able to know what the law is and to be able to figure that out. And at the same time, it's good for educational purposes because it helps you learn what are the potential cases that we might be thinking of, we might be dealing with on whatever issue is. So this is what Elizabeth Shanks Alexander says about case law in Mishnaic law. By concretely stating two or more possible resolutions, the dispute form makes vividly clear that the scenario in question might be plausibly understood according to two different paradigms. The most important thing to take away from that sentence is that there is often a dispute form in which you have different individuals who are arguing one with the other. So I'm just going to scroll down for a moment. This is the Mishnah from 87a. So you can see that dispute form, and especially as it appears with Rabbi Yehuda. The Mishnah teaches an additional halacha with regard to sales, and anyone who sells wine, oil, or similar liquids is obligated, after he transfers the liquid into a buyer's vessel, to drip for him 3 extra drops from the measure. After he drips those 3 drops, if he turned the barrel on its side and drained out the last bits of liquid that it contained, those extra drops belongs to the seller, and he is not required to give these last drops to the buyer. And a storekeeper is not obligated to drip 3 drops because he is too busy to do this constantly, meaning that when you are giving the item to someone, that if you are a seller that and you turn the barrel over, some of the content is going to fall out. And so the idea is you give them extra drips to be able to make up, to be able to give that just measurement of what it is they paid for. But the problem with the storekeeper is that if they're obligated to do it, it's going to be difficult to do, because if you're running a store, you're always going to be like rolling up the barrels and then giving more extra drops, and then somebody else coming and then rolling up the barrel and giving them extra drops. It's going to be very taxing, so you don't want to do it. Rabbi Yehuda says, if the sale occurs on Shabbat Eve as nightfall arrives, one is exempt from dripping these drops, as there is a need to complete the transaction before Shabbat begins. Now, we're going to understand a little bit more about the context of Rabbi Yehuda's statement, but the point here is that there is a dispute between the Tana Kama, the one who is writing the text or is editing the text, and Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda is mentioned. That is to say, when thinking about the way that especially the Mishnah is written, is that anybody who is mentioned specifically is brought to bring a dispute against the primary view of that Mishnah. The question is the reason why they're being brought in as a dispute a legal purpose, meaning that there is another possible way to look at the law, or as an educational purpose to think about how might be many other different cases to consider, and that by bringing somebody to make an argument, what they're really doing is saying, don't just stop learning the law, learn about all the possibilities that might happen with the law and think those through. Educational versus legal. Now, Shanks Alexander, she has a particular way of viewing it, which is much more based off of the educational idea. Here's what she says. It is interesting to consider the possibility that the dispute form is as ubiquitous as it is in the Mishnah because it promotes a nuanced understanding of borderline cases. Right? If you're trying to create a system, you need to be able to know not what the law is in any regular instance, but what do you do in borderline cases? The presence of the dispute helps students, readers, or listeners tease out various resolutions warranted by a particular case. It sensitizes the nuance of detail on which the different legal resolutions rest and models a kind of legal analysis they can repeat on their own in other contexts. In other words, the Mishnah is not designed to tell us what is the law. The Mishnah is designed to tell us how we can figure out the law for ourselves. That's what she's really trying to emphasize here. And you can kind of see that when it comes to Rabbi Yehuda and the way that he's understood within the context of the Gemara. Because what the Gemara is trying to do is trying to say, okay, Rabbi Yehuda says something about that it's exempt to be obligated to drip 3 drops on Shabbat because his nightfall arrives. So, but why is that brought up here? What is the borderline case that we're thinking of? So here's what we got the Gemara. The Mishnah, I'm sorry, not that. Actually, no, it is. The Mishnah teaches, and a storekeeper is not obligated to drip 3 drops. Rabbi Yehuda says if the sale occurs on Shabbat Eve as nightfall arrives, one is exempt from dripping these drops. A dilemma was raised before the sages. Is Rabbi Yehuda referring to the first clause of the Mishnah, i.e., the clause of that the seller does not have does not should not have to give 3 drops, because according to the what's called the Resha, the early part of the Mishnah, that the seller must give 3 drops to make up for the fact that you're going to lose some when you turn the barrel over. Because if that's the case, then his ruling is lenient, as the Mishnah states that one must drip 3 drops, and he states that on Shabbat Eve one is exempt from doing so. Or perhaps he is referring to the latter clause and is stringent, meaning he's talking about how in the latter case, where we're talking about about a seller, we're actually saying that he's being more stringent here, as the Mishnah teaches that a storekeeper is always exempt, whereas Rabbi Yehuda rules that this is the halacha only on Shabbat Eve, meaning that for a seller, that when they sell their goods in their store, that they have to give the 3 drops, even if it seems onerous. The only time they don't have to do it is on Shabbat, is right by Shabbat. In which case, Rabbi Yehuda is actually being more machmir, more stringent than what the Tanakama is, because he's saying that even the store seller is required to give those 3 drops during the rest of the week. So Gemara answers, come in here, a resolution of this dilemma, as it is taught in a Braita that Rabbi Yehuda says, on Shabbat Eve at nightfall, a storekeeper is exempt because the storekeeper is busy. This proves that Rabbi Yehuda was referring to the latter clause of the Mishnah, i.e., he exempts the storekeeper from dripping the drops only on Shabbat Eve. So, want to pause here for a quick second, because what he's really doing here, or what the Gemara is really doing, is trying to understand how Rabbi Yehuda functions within the context of a discussion in the Gemara. And it's saying, here's what Rabbi Yehuda's opinion was about. He was for this one point of view. But here's the kicker. The reason the Gemara is doing this is because the Gemara is looking at the text not as an educational text. It's looking at it as a legal text. And the problem that the Gemara has is that when you have another rabbi, another Tana appear, that there is a dispute that is a reasonable dispute to be or to have. And the challenge is, how do we resolve Rabbi Yehuda's statement that doesn't contradict the statements that come before? Now, what does that really mean for us? I think what it really means is when we have an argument, right? When we're called Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, that there are these and those are the words of the living God, that we say that Judaism is really teaching us that you can have many different opinions and all are accepted in Torah. I'm here to say that may not actually be the case. It may not be the case that there are many different views in Torah. In fact, it may be the case that from the perspective of the Gemara, in the way that it uses Rabbi Yehuda, it's saying there really is only one way, and we just have to find a way to make it all make sense with these different perspectives that are out there. So that we need to make Rabbi Yehuda make sense with the Gemara that came beforehand, or sorry, with the Tanakama, with the words of the sages that came beforehand. We have to find a way to resolve it, because if you're making law, like think about it as a judge or thinking about it as a society. If you're making law, you don't want there to be contradiction. You want it to be clear. Here is what you do in this case. You don't really want to have different sides. Okay? But from an educational standpoint, which may be what the original Mishnah was trying to do, it's saying we want to help train you by understanding the way to view different cases as they might come up, and in which case you may have different opinions based upon whatever the situation might be. So this is where the tension comes about what is the Mishnah, especially compared to what the Gemara is. Okay, I want to emphasize this point about the different ways of viewing how these individual rabbis, especially Rabbi Yehuda, is mentioned and what their purpose is, by understanding a little piece of commentary that appears in it's actually not really in any commentary you might have on the Mishnah, except that it appears in a set of Mishnayot that is edited by an Israeli rabbi whose name is Rabbi Pinchas Kehati, who passed away in the 1970s, who was a great scholar in Israel and basically edited the Mishnah into real, understandable Hebrew. So what Steinsaltz did for the Gemara, Kehati did for the Mishnah. Okay? Now, I'm going to get to his point in a moment. But before I get there, I want to bring in this other little teaching from a scholar talking about the idea of orality and narratives. It comes from Ishai Rosenzweig about the ways in which Mishnah is actually taught. And he's actually talking about the way that Elizabeth Shanks discusses it, as we talked about earlier. Rather than as a testimony to a not yet conceptual legal mind, Elizabeth Shanks Alexander reads casuistic halakha as a pedagogic instruction in legal thinking, even while teaching new laws. Different types of casuistic styles are read by Alexander as specific devices to train students in various kinds of legal inference. She thus agrees with Abraham Goldberg's famous thesis of the Mishnah as a teaching manual rather than as a legal code or anthology, but asserts that the teaching in this manual should not be restricted to legal content only, but more generally to legal thought and analysis. So I wanted to do that as kind of a synopsis of what is it I was been sharing before. Okay? But now we get to ways in which we have been trained to think about these texts in a certain way, and how the way in which we've been trained with it, which also appears, by the way, in how the Gemara is trying to figure it out, can run in conflict with the way in which maybe the Mishnah was designed. So Rabbi Pinchas Kehati, in his commentary, in his description of the Mishnah, says the following. I'm going to read it in Hebrew. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Erev Shabbat im chashecha hatur. Okay? So this is just the statement from Rabbi Yehuda in the Mishnah. Shabbat Eve as nightfall, you're exempt. But then this in italics is Rav Kahati's emendation. Ve'ein halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda. And the law is not according to Rabbi Yehuda. So this is what he's basically saying. He's saying that in this case, and I'm not just going to show you just this case, but there are other cases too. When you have a rabbi like Rabbi Yehuda, who's mentioned many, many times, so over 600 times in all of Mishnah, appears at the end of a Mishnah with a different opinion, by bringing him at the end of the discussion, you're bringing in an opinion that is valid, but is not accepted as halacha. This is where the idea of having multiple opinions really comes from, because it is acceptable as an idea for what an opinion could be, but it's not accepted as what the quote unquote halacha is that you're supposed to follow. And that's what the role is. So anytime you would see a rabbi being mentioned, especially at the end of a Mishnah, they're brought to bring this opinion in Rabbi in Pinchas Kehati's mind in order to teach you what the halacha is not. Okay? And by the way, you can kind of see this appear in many other places in the corpus of Mishnah. So you have in Mishnah Demai, Rabbi Yehuda says all unripe figs are exempt except for those from a tree that bears fruit twice a year. Ein halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda. Mishnah Masrot, a sukkah used in the festival of Sukkot, Rabbi Yehuda says this renders produce liable for tithes, but the sages exempt. And this is a key thing. Sometimes you have just what the rabbi mentions, and then sometimes you have the sages actually being mentioned as disagreeing with Rabbi Yehuda, because the core law, if the Mishnah is a legal text, it teaches us that the Chachamim, the unattributed point of view by the majority, they're correct. Individual rabbis are not. So here we see the Chachamim disagree with Rabbi Yehuda. Okay? And there are others example here. Even for Mishnah Sanhedrin, Rabbi Yehuda deems him liable and the rabbis exempt him. Right? It appears throughout. And again in Mishnah Sanhedrin. Okay? But this is what's crazy. Coming back to our set of Mishnayot. This is the next Mishnah in our learning from this week. With regard to one who sends his son to a storekeeper with a pundeyon, a coin worth 2 isar in his hand, and a storekeeper measured oil for him for 1 isar and gave him the second isar as change. Okay, they're just talking about measurements of how much money all these different items are. You get change, great. and the son broke the jug and lost the Isar, the storekeeper must compensate the father as he gave the jug and coin to one who is not halakhically competent, because the whole idea is that this boy is getting the oil, but you can't rely upon him because he's not halakhically competent. That's why the whole bar mitzvah thing is not just about praying in shul or being counted a minyan. It's about the fact that you are now competent to be able to do actions like other adults are in the world. Rabbi Yehuda exempts him from liability as he holds that the father sent his son in order to do this, i.e., to bring back the jug and the coin, meaning he just sent him to kind of figure out, all right, how much is this going to cost? Come home. I'll then, dad will go and actually make the transaction. He wasn't expecting the son to actually take care of it. All right, that's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. If we're going by what we've seen before, Rabbi Yehuda would be Ein Halacha Ke Rabbi Yehuda. But then here's the issue. Umodim Chachamim LeRabbi Yehuda. And the rabbis concede to Rabbi Yehuda. Wait a second. How are the rabbis supposed to concede to Rabbi Yehuda? With regard to a case when the jug is in the hand of a child and the storekeeper measured the oil into it, that the storekeeper is exempt if the child breaks the jug. Now, because we're coming to the end, I would have gone a little bit further into the way that the Gemara handles it. But all I'm going to say is this, and if you want, you can take a look in what I've shared in the document itself in the link. But the Gemara almost has no idea what to do with that. It struggles to figure out how is it possible to bring in a different point of view and the Chachamim agree with him. Why would they have to bring those in? And it's in those scenarios where the Gemara is really at odds to figure out what is the halacha? How is it supposed to work? That you then get many of the statements, many of the drashot, many of the other teachings that seem completely separate, analogous to what it is we're talking about, not really all that connected, but there may be certain phrases that connect it to a different story because they have to be bringing in other voices. Shmuel appears here, and they're saying he has to agree with Shmuel here, but then Shmuel said over there. Like the more that they had to think about how to reconcile these two from a legal point of view, the harder it is for them to do it, and the more interesting the Gemara gets because it brings in a whole variety of different texts. But it may be missing the point that the job of the Mishnah was to say, here is a case where actually we're trying to learn how to make an agreement, how to figure out cases. And in this case, Rabbi Yehuda agrees with the Chachamim. And how do they agree with the Chachamim? That is what the issue is, because we're trying to teach you how to think about law. We're not trying to make law. We're not trying to make law. We're trying to teach you how to make law and how to understand law. And so that, I think, is what the Mishnah is. And it would be a fascinating class to really understand more about how the goals of the Mishnah and the goals of the Gemara may actually be very different.
Thank you, Rabbi Sachs, and thank you for highlighting Elizabeth Shanks Alexander's scholarship for us, because it is really interesting stuff. We had a request in the chat that you post a link to that article. Is it behind a paywall? Do you
It
happen to know?
is. Yeah,
It
but
probably
I have it. I actually have it downloaded because I got it through as an alum to. I went to JTS Columbia for undergrad, List College. Great school, great combo school. And as an alum for Columbia, I get access to JSTOR online. So I downloaded the copy, and I'm happy. I'll send it to you, Rachel, to
okay.
have, and then feel free to send it out to the group.
Okay, so folks, maybe email us for it. I don't know if do we have a logical email to send that all out on? I think
I
it's
don't.
probably better if folks email in to me, R.
Right.
Scheinerman at myjewishlearning.com. I'll
If
put
you
it
want it
here,
that
or
way, yeah.
community at myjewishlearning.com.
Yeah.
Sorry, putting this in, can't talk and type. To request the article. She also has a book based on that research. I think it's called Transmitting Mishnah. It's probably not cheap like these old academic books
They're not.
generally are, but a lot
The
of that is
other
based on her dissertation research.
and the other one, just so you know, is because I've also brought the text from, where is it? From Ishai Rosenzwei's Orality, Narrative, Rhetoric, New Directions in Mishnah Research. I'm also happy to share that too.
Okay. Thank you so much. All
You're
right. It is an
welcome.
ongoing, fascinating conversation to try and figure out what these texts really are. What is the genre? What is their purpose? I think that I've said this before in this group, but I think that one of the things that's tricky for us is we are so used to things being in very clear and contained genres in the modern world, right? This is a spy novel. This is a legal code. This is a
Mhm.
romance, all right? And in the ancient world, especially when communities would not have a huge number of texts and they were produced in this communal way and very expensive to produce, that these texts were really much more multifunctional and did a lot of different things.
Yeah.
Um, and didn't fall neatly necessarily into those genres that we expect now when we can, print on demand and things like that. So always a really interesting conversation to think on a meta level about what are the rabbis doing here,
Hmm.
and why, and to see the different generations and their different motivations. So thank you for making that all so clear for us today, and also for connecting the material to Rosh Hashanah at the top for us, because that
My
is
pleasure.
coming up soon, very, very soon. So
Absolutely.
it was lovely to see you all today, and we will see you again in this space in exactly 1 week. Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Sachs. Thank you,
Take care,
everyone.
everyone. Bye.
Bye.